Okay, good afternoon. The Northern crisis had a profound impact on society south of the border, though that impact barely featured last year in discussion of the anniversary of civil rights. So I'm going to try and look at the popular impact of August in the context of the long 1969, because it was really October 1968 which reawakened popular southern interest in the North. I'm going to start there. In the week following the Derry March of 5th of October 68, there were solidarity demonstrations across the south, 3 of them in Dublin alone. The largest of them, organised by the Labour Party, heard an emotional eyewitness account from Gerry Fitt, who warned that if Stormont suppressed future protests, then the people of Dublin, young men and women, will cross over the border. Dublin's Lord Mayor, Frank Cluskey, promised the people of the North that their days of abandonment are very near at an end. From then on, protests in Dublin and elsewhere followed the tempo of Northern events. During the spring of 1969, for example, there were demonstrations in Dublin after Burntullet, after Newry, and so on. But these also reflected a growing culture of confrontation in the city since 1967, particularly around the issue of housing, which often involved the same people, Republicans and the left, who would mobilise again during August 1969. Indeed, during the spring of 1969, civil rights committees were established across the Republic of Ireland. But these were committees that borrowed the language of Northern protest, but were concerned with travellers' rights, or itinerant rights as it was called at the time, and about the Gaeltacht and so on. Indeed, the way in which the rhetoric of solidarity initially was framed in the South very much reflected southern political concerns. Derry had focused attention on civil rights, just as the Republic was preoccupied with an attempt by the Fianna Fáil government to replace the proportional representation voting system. Campaigners noted that the introduction of PR was one of the demands of Northern protesters. Labour's Barry Desmond asserted that if PR is abolished, the cities of our Republic will be carved up in the same manner as the notorious ward system of Derry. As it happened, the Fianna Fáil government were humiliated in the PR referendum, and to make matters worse, their nationalist credentials were also increasingly called into question. Labour Party leader Brendan Corish alleged that the government's failure to defend nationalists in Derry revealed the fiction of the Fianna Fáil claim that they in any way represent the Republican tradition. While leading Fine Gael TDs noted how Fianna Fáil had essentially been in office with only 2 intervals since 1932 and had never seriously challenged partition or discrimination in that time. I don't think it's unconnected that it is in the winter of 1968 that Neil Blaney and others begin to take a much more publicly anti-partitionist line, which they simply hadn't done publicly, at least until that point. So for radicals, the referendum result and the growing crisis in the North seemed to confirm the belief of the Irish Times political correspondent Michael McInerney in January 1969 that something deep was stirring in the whole of Ireland. At Sinn Féin's Ard Fheis in December, party president Tomás McGilla asserted that they were witnessing what we hope is the beginning of the disintegration of 2 old and corrupt parties in Belfast and Dublin. Campaigners indeed continued to make comparisons between repressive legislation north and south. Labour's Conor Cruise O'Brien described a proposed criminal justice bill as an encouragement to the Unionist Party in its continuing denial of civil rights in the 6 counties. At the Labour Party conference in January 1969, again bringing first-hand news of events, this time from Newry, Gerry Fitt asserted that any Labour leader who is intimidated by the sight of a baton, whether it's wielded by an RUC man or a member of the Garda, is unworthy of the name of Labour. However, despite this rhetoric and the assertion by radicals that north and south the struggle is the same, the issue generally played little role in the June 1969 election, outside essentially from some border counties. That election campaign was most notable for the alarmist rhetoric from Fianna Fáil about extreme left-wing socialists preaching class warfare in the Labour Party supposedly, and also for the comfortable victory won in the end by Jack Lynch's party. The IRA were in the headlines, though for attacks on foreign property in the south rather than activities across the border. Indeed, the Irish government had been on the verge of introducing special legislation against the IRA before the North exploded. Thanks to Rob Savage's work in RTE archives, we know that Jack Lynch met senior media figures from the press and TV in early August and asked them to refrain from publicising IRA statements or using language which he claimed romanticised the IRA in what he called immature minds. However, events across the border later that month transformed the political mood and made the government's plan to introduce new legislation actually impossible, that year at least. So the Battle of the Bogside, of course, begins on Tuesday, the 12th of August. On the night of Wednesday the 13th of August, Jack Lynch gave his special address on RTE and announced that Irish Army field hospitals were being established near the border. That evening, 2,500 people attended a Sinn Féin rally at Dublin's GPO, which heard demands that the government use all the resources at their disposal, including military force, to defend the people in the 6 counties. This crowd swelled to over 4,000 as it marched on the British Embassy. Now numbers far beyond the ranks of Republicans and the left were being mobilised on this issue. The following night, Belfast had exploded, with reports suggesting that Catholics were being massacred. One teenager remembered RTE showing street after street of houses on fire, people streaming out of their homes carrying bundles of clothes, women and children crying, men trying to put out fires, and gunfire in the background. At lunchtime on the Friday, the day after, 400 people gathered outside the British Embassy in Merrion Square, including dock workers who'd taken strike action in protest. The Labour TD Michael O'Leary complained to the embassy about the display of a Union flag being flown in celebration of Princess Anne's birthday. The flag was torn down and burnt, a tricolour was hoisted on a nearby lamppost, and several of the embassy windows were broken by stones. That evening, 3,000 joined another Sinn Féin protest at the General Post Office. Tomás McGilla claimed that the IRA had been in action in Belfast, but that they needed arms, and if the Irish Army would not use their weapons, they should give them to us. After the rally, most of the crowd marched to nearby Collins Barracks, demanded guns, and clashed with Gardaí before they dispersed. That rally also heard a call for volunteers to go north, with promises of transport. Over 150 people, many of them teenagers, boarded buses, which arrived in Dundalk in the early hours of the morning. That town had seen a march of 2,000 that evening, although it was quiet by the time the Dubliners arrived, and amid scenes of confusion, some of the group went to Dundalk Army Barracks, while others boarded a truck and headed for the border. And indeed, some of these people did reach Belfast over the next few days. Meanwhile, Irish troops had also been moved north. One Irish Army officer recalled how we passed out through the gates of Fitzgerald Camp Fermoy in Cork late afternoon, 14th of August. And when we turned left onto the main Cork to Dublin road, there was a large crowd of family members, townspeople and well-wishers there to say goodbye and cheer us on our way. This was repeated again as we passed through Mitchelstown, and it seemed increasingly by even larger crowds as we went through the various towns along our route until we came to Portlaoise and Mountmellick, where there seemed to be huge crowds cheering us on. With far less fanfare, the IRA also sent members to border areas, initially with instructions to draw police away from Belfast. A gun and grenade attack on Crossmaglen REC barracks was carried out on Sunday, August 17th, but this was the only operation carried out by them, though the presence of armed IRA members in certain areas was widely noted in the press at the time. But by Saturday the 16th, at least 7 people had died in Belfast and hundreds had been forced from their homes. That day saw almost continuous demonstrations in Dublin city centre. By the evening, crowds filled 2/3 of O'Connell Street, where they were addressed by, among others, 3 Stormont MPs, Paddy Kennedy, Paddy Devlin and Paddy O'Hanlon. Devlin asserted, "The only way we can defend ourselves is with guns. We need them." Chants of "we want guns" interrupted several of the speeches, and at one point a man produced a pistol and waved it in the air. After 8 p.m, some 2,000 people marched to Merrion Square, where they made a determined effort to reach the British Embassy. Petrol bombs and stones were thrown at Gardaí, and a garage was damaged in a quest for ammunition. Gardaí baton charged the crowd, forced them back towards the city centre, but clashes continued as teenagers and people leaving pubs and cinemas joined in the fighting. Gardaí were taunted as Gestapo, B special bastards, and pelted with missiles. Over 50 people, including 16 guards, were injured, and 60 shop windows were smashed as trouble in the city centre continued until 3 in the morning. The next day, Sunday, the tricolour flew at half-mast at Croke Park, where the All-Ireland hurling semi-final was taking place, featuring Kilkenny and London, and that doesn't happen very often. The GAA President, Seamus O'Riordan, addressed fans and expressed support for our people in the 6-county area and their struggle against oppression, and a collection was taken up for relief. Meanwhile, 1,000 people attended another rally at the GPO, where speakers warned them against further confrontation. UCD lecturer Liam de Puer described those involved in the previous night's violence as gurriers, while a statement from the 3 Northern MPs condemned squalid incidents of flag burning, rioting and public incitement in Dublin. Despite this, several hundred people tried to hold a sit-down in O'Connell Street. When Gardaí moved to disperse them, they were joined by large numbers of teenagers who began smashing windows. Rubbish bins were used as barricades, cars were pelted with stones, and several shops were looted. Observers claimed that people were battened indiscriminately, a priest describing Gardaí engaging in an uncontrolled and half-frenzied race down the street, flattening anyone who happened to be slow of pace. In response, one Garda explained that, "We've been out for 3 nights and our men are very fatigued. This crowd is just looking for trouble and people are deliberately provoking us. Sinn Féin disclaimed involvement in the street clashes, and the newly formed National Solidarity Committee cancelled a Monday night rally in order to avoid more trouble. But across the state, protest meetings, generally organised by Republicans, sometimes in cooperation with the left, continued. Men boarded a British vessel at Burtonport and burned its ensign. Dock workers in Galway struck and joined Irish Transport and General Workers Union members in the city in marching to a protest rally in Eyre Square, demanding intervention. Dockers and meat factory workers in Sligo also took strike action and demanded that the Irish Army cross the border. The President of the Union of Students in Ireland, Kieran McKeown, called for Irish troops to occupy one of the border counties in order to create an international incident and force United Nations intervention. At a special meeting of Dublin Trades Council, Matt Merrigan of the Amalgamated Transport and General Workers Union also called for military intervention to force the UN to take action. Now, Merrigan's union was British based, it was the T&G here in the north and had a substantial Northern Protestant membership, as it happens. But George O'Malley of the Irish Transport Union, which was also cross-border, but very much a largely Catholic union, also asked that Dublin trade unionists dig into their pockets and give everything needed, perhaps even arms. A national relief fund was set up with former Fine Gael TD Declan Costello as chairman, along with Mickey Mullen from the Transport Union, Labour Party General Secretary Brendan Halligan and Fine Gael's TF O'Higgins. It was supported by Minter na Tíre, the National Association of Tenants Organisations, student groups and Catholic, Protestant and Jewish clergymen. Mullen had already visited union branches in Belfast and Derry, but he returned again with Declan Costello in late August to oversee plans for distributing relief funds. Dublin businessman Dermot Ryan, with the support of former Taoiseach Sean Lamass, established a Northern Ireland Interdenominational Association for Stricken Families and raised £3,000 within a few days. The government itself urged that money be channelled through the Red Cross, which collected about £1,200 in 2 days. Various trade unions, the Limerick Redemptorist Art Confraternity, the Irish Countrymen's Association, the National Farmers Association, the GAA and the Republican movement were all collecting money, medical supplies and provisions, and most towns and villages across the Republic saw some form of fundraising for Northern relief. The most obvious sign of the crisis, however, were the refugees themselves, most of them women and children. They were accommodated in military camps with the aid of the Red Cross. So during August, the Irish Army looked after officially 720 people, the majority at Gormanstown Camp in County Meath, though smaller numbers were sent to Finner Camp in Donegal and also to bases in Kildare. The Limerick Leader reminded its readers that not so long ago the starving people of far-flung Biafra cried out for aid. Limerick answered the call. Let us now answer the call from our compatriots north of the border. Let every organisation, every businessman, every man, woman and child give, and give until it hurts. 50 children from Ardoyne were accommodated in Limerick, while 200 people from Andersonstown were housed in hospitals and schools in Mullingar. And there were other people who came across unofficially to relatives and so on in that period. Across the state, local businesses donated food and clothing. Trips to the cinema, trips to Dublin Zoo and Butlin's holiday camp were organised for the young refugees from Gormanstown and so on. And these responses would be repeated again in 1970, in August 1971, and on the greatest scale in July 1972, when over 10,000 people would come south. But in August 1969, to some at least, it also seemed that partition might itself be nearing an end. While not all were as jubilant as Monaghan councillor James Deary, who announced, "War is coming, war there must be," the Connacht Tribune recognised that the people of the 26 counties were conditioned to take the north by force during those ugly early nights of killing. These emotions were felt across party lines. One Fine Gael supporter in Roscommon responded immediately and passionately on the side of the nationalists. If Lynch had sent in the army, he felt, we could all once again be on the same side. And people indeed talked about the need to heal Civil War divisions once and for all, because now the national question was again paramount. While there was recognition that many nationalists, particularly in Belfast, had welcomed British troops, Irish Transport Union President Fintan Kennedy made clear that his union would never accept that part of our country is occupied. Fine Gael leader Liam Cosgrave bemoaned the arrival of the largest British army in this country since they surrendered Dublin Castle to Michael Collins in 1922, and asserted that this was a step backwards that can never be welcomed. He claimed all the present unrest and tragic loss of life is directly traceable to the British designed and enacted partition of Ireland. This, Cosgrave concluded, could only be remedied by granting to Ireland the unity to which our people are intended. So as I say, across party lines there was a sense that things had changed for once and for all and that something had to be done. about partition. In mid-August, several Labour TDs and senators visited Belfast, Armagh and Derry. Conor Cruise O'Brien noted how the courage, determination and tactical skill of the Bogsiders had succeeded in creating an area in which Stormont's writ no longer ran. Monaghan Fine Gael TDs Billy Fox and John Conlon also went to the Bogside on the Falls during August. On his return, Fox conveyed the Derry Defence Committee's demands to Monaghan Council, earning him the nickname Bogside Billy among some local cynics. Away from most people's attention, the Republican movement was recruiting, but was also experiencing a growing internal crisis, while at cabinet level the fallout from August would result ultimately in the arms trial. Dublin and Belfast buzzed with rumours in August and September about arms shipments and promises of funding for the IRA. Indeed, the British ambassador Andrew Gilchrist worried during that month what these events might provoke among what he called a notoriously emotional people, and speculated that if he were a fire insurance company, I would not like to have the British Embassy on my books, which was prophetic at least. The clashes in Dublin had shown that there were some, however, particularly the young, who had little compunction about fighting the Gardaí. The Irish press warned about wild men in the south who had shown their influence in acts of hooliganism around the streets of Dublin, and the Fianna Fáil supporting Irish press warned that this would hinder rather than help the people of the north. Sligo Fianna Fáil TD Ray McSherry asserted that wildcat displays such as strike action were of no benefit to people in the north and that people should rally behind the government led by Jack Lynch. A few quietly even expressed public worries about unification itself. Margaret Tynan, the Fine Gael mayor of Kilkenny, asked, "Do we want the north? Can we afford the north? Does the north want to come in?" Clearly we could not afford subsidies to the north of the magnitude of British subsidies. But there were also other worries, particularly about violence. There had been occasions where anger over events in Belfast and Derry had been directed at southern Protestants. In Arklow, a small Presbyterian church had been firebombed. In Enniscorthy, a petrol bomb was thrown at a Protestant-owned shop. And there were similar incidents in Donegal and Monaghan, amid widespread allegations that Protestants there were members of the B Specials and had crossed over the border to take part in the fighting. Indeed, the reality of conflict was also brought home with the first death in October of a UVF member. Thomas MacDougall died while trying to bomb the ESB station at Ballyshannon in County Donegal. The attitude of some northern radicals was also causing concern. Speaking to 2,000 people in Limerick, Bernadette Devlin explained that the things that had brought the people of the north onto the streets were also in existence in the south. If Mr. Lynch had sent one soldier across the border, he would not have been welcome, because the things that people in the north were fighting against were in existence in the south. The Limerick leader was particularly upset by Devlin's speech and also by her criticism of the Gardaí and her alleging that they were every bit as bad as specials, who, in the Limerick leader's words, terrorised the people of our northern counties. The paper asserted, "The sooner Miss Devlin realises the seriousness of the damage she is doing, then the better for everyone in this country." And it's clear by the winter of 1969 there is a disconnect between the rhetoric of some northern radicals and the mood of people in the south. Certainly the audience in Limerick would have been quite bemused by Bernadette saying that the Irish Army would not have been welcome, since most of them would have assumed that was what Northern Nationalists wanted to happen in August 1969. The mobilisations of 1969 would be dwarfed within 2 years by those after Bloody Sunday in 1972. While street protests and street violence, Republican activity, security legislation, refugees, fundraising, sectarianism and so on would all become features of the politics of the next few years, as would bitter divisions about how to respond, along with a growing suspicion of Northern Nationalists and their concerns. Indeed, as early as June 1970, the Irish press had asserted that this state doesn't need Northerners, either coming or being brought to take sides in its internal affairs. While in July 1972, the maverick Mayo TD Joe Lenihan would claim that the Northern people were the authors of their own destruction, and when thousands of them were given sanctuary down here, they wrecked every place they went. As for the hopes of the leftists of 1969, one of them, Tony Gregory, recalled 20 years later that in his view, there was a huge radicalism among young people, and probably all of that was diverted or destroyed by the North. The North blew up and it dissipated. But all those things are for another day's discussion, so thank you.